Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett, and today I'm going to read from my book, Seven Sisters, The Voyage, Chapter 6A. Here it is. Caroline learned to survive on the rations she was given each week. She even learned how to boil water. The other sisters took every chance to give her instruction and demonstrations on how to cook. The routine of standing in line for the cooking galley had become commonplace. The sisters each had their assignments, and it was Caroline and Lavinia's turn to do the cooking this week. Caroline was fascinated with all the workings behind cooking a meal for a family. She remembered how upset she got back home when her dinner was late for any reason. Now she was developing patience and enjoyed the diversion to the galley twice a day. She used this opportunity to learn new methods to improve her cooking skills. The galley was busy as usual, with 9 people standing around the large stove on 3 sides, holding onto their tea kettles or pot handles. The steward on the one side of the stove supervised the cooking and stoked the fire to keep the temperature constant. It didn't take long for water to heat up in the tea kettles, and as soon as it was boiling, the women grasped the handles with their skirts or hot pads and cautiously left the galley. Others took a bit longer at the stove as they tried to soften beans, rice, or peas. Waiting for their turn, Lavinia and Caroline chatted quietly in the line that extended down the hallway outside the galley. Sister Nightingale and Sister Walmsley, her sister-in-law, shortly fell in line behind them. These 2 women were getting a reputation on board for their grousing and fault-finding, and Lavinia and Caroline didn't want to get caught up in their contentious talk, so they nodded their greetings and continued talking with each other. Sister Nightingale soon started grumbling for all to hear. "I stood in this line for an hour yesterday, and when I finally got my pot on the stove, the ship lurched, and every pot went onto the floor. Rice, peas, oatmeal, and all. We had to wait for it all to be cleaned up before we could start over again." "This is certainly a test of our faith," Sister Walmsley complained. "And a trial to our stomachs," Sister Nightingale grieved. Caroline and Lavinia were thankful when 2 more cooks left their spots around the stove so they could move inside the galley away from these 2 disgruntled women. Caroline smiled and rolled her eyes knowingly at Lavinia as they put their pots on the stove top and went back to chatting. Soon they weren't paying attention to their pots like they should have been. Lavinia was gesturing with her hands, and Caroline wasn't holding on to her handle with any consistency. Before long, Sister Nightingale and Walmsley came in and stood next to them. Lavinia was engrossed in her conversation with Caroline. "You know, I think I packed a small tin of cinnamon in one of my boxes. When we get back to our berths, I'll try to find it to put in our rice. Then we'll have rice pudding." "Oh, how I used to love rice pudding Jossie made for me," said Caroline, smiling in reverie. Sister Walmsley was getting annoyed at Caroline's inattention. She could see that if she moved Caroline's pot to the back of the stove and put her pot in the front, she would have a hotter spot. So while Lavinia and Caroline were absorbed in their conversation, she stealthily moved Caroline's pot. As Caroline's pot cooled down, Mrs. Walmsley's pot heated up and was soon steaming nicely. Suddenly the ship tilted sharply, and Caroline and Lavinia were brought back to the task at hand when their pots started sliding across the stove. "Sisters, you'd better watch your pots," yelled the steward sharply. Caroline grabbed hers, suddenly realizing what Sister Walmsley had done. Lavinia retrieved hers also and tried for some humor. "A watched pot never boils," she laughed. The steward didn't share her levity, however, and looking around found another offender at the stove. "Brother Proctor, you need to watch your pot too. It's boiling over." "Oh my goodness," Brother Proctor said as he grabbed the handle and adjusted the lid. Then he experienced a searing pain that caused him to drop the whole pot of peas, which splashed up and covered his hand. "Yow, I'm scalded to death, by jigger. I'm speechless," he yelled as he shook his hand and tried to brush off the burning peas. The steward was now pushed beyond the point of aggravation. "You old fool. If you can't tend to your cooking better than that, you deserve to be scalded." "Is that a fact?" said Brother Proctor, momentarily forgetting his burned hand as he grabbed his pot and hit the steward on the head with a loud clank. "Ow!" yelled the steward, rubbing his head and staggering a bit. "Why, you old coot," he said as he raised his poker high and hit the old man on the shoulder. The two sisters screamed as they backed away from the fight. "I'll wring your nose," said the old man as he started for the steward. Caroline was shocked at the uncivilized exchange that was taking place before her. She had had enough. She took no thought to her own safety and automatically stepped between the two men. "You two stop this right now," she said commandingly. "I said stop it. I saw the whole thing, and I think you should each seek forgiveness from the other. We have only been on this voyage for 2 weeks and have many more weeks to go. We can't have everyone snapping at each other and hitting one another with pots and pokers." Getting up her nerve, Lavinia chipped in. "Contention is of the devil." Not waiting for an argument, Caroline turned to Brother Proctor. "You apologize first." Brother Proctor didn't want to apologize, but finally gave in, realizing the steward probably didn't have any religious training to speak of and needed an example to follow. "I apologize for not minding my pot," he said quietly. The steward looked around for someone to side with him, but decided he'd better comply with Caroline's request. Her face was resolute and unyielding as she stood with her arms folded. "I apologize that I provoked you," he said grudgingly. "That's better," said Caroline, who wasn't about to let this opportunity go by without letting Sisters Nightingale and Walmsley know that they too were not wholly without offense. "We would all do with a little less grumbling while on board this ship." "We could all do with a little less grumbling while on board this ship," she said, "or we are going to have a most unpleasant season of it." The finally remorseful steward turned to Brother Proctor. "You'd better go up and see if Doc Bell will bandage your hand." "It pains like the very devil," muttered Brother Proctor as he left. Upon his exit, Lavinia was brought back to reality as she sniffed. "Oh, Caroline, our rice has scorched," she said as she ran to grab their 2 pots off the stove. The other cooks followed suit and rescued their pots as well. In total frustration and disgust, Caroline took her pot from Lavinia and headed for the door, speaking loud enough for all to hear. "Do you know what I'm thinking, Lavinia? A nice, hard sea biscuit will taste just fine for supper tonight." Phoebe and Fanny peered into the white wicker birdcage that sat between them on the deck. "I thought maybe a little fresh air would make her sing. We've been here almost an hour and not so much as a peep," said Phoebe. "She doesn't look well at all," said Fanny. "She's sort of trembling." They both watched intently as their little canary teetered on its perch. Then suddenly it toppled off. "Oh, Fanny," exclaimed Phoebe, "I think she's fainted." "Poke her," encouraged Fanny. Phoebe opened the cage door, warily reached in, and nudged the little bird with her finger. "She's not moving," she announced. Suddenly it dawned on Fanny. "She hasn't fainted. She's dead!" And she began howling loudly. Almost at the same time, Phoebe figured it out and joined with Fanny to double the volume of ear-splitting shrieks. Mr. Huntley was working on some lines when all this frightfully alarming noise began. He was afraid some bodily harm was being inflicted on some of the passengers, and his rescue instincts took over. He dashed toward the sound, and coming around the mast, he saw that the huge noise was coming from 2 very small girls. He soon recognized who he was dealing with. "What's the matter, twinsies?" he said urgently. "Lovey's dead," Phoebe blurted out. "Who's Lovey?" Fanny wiped her nose on her sleeve. "Our canary bird," she sobbed. Huntley glanced at the birdcage and the tiny mound of yellow feathers on the floor of it. Now he understood. The twins were having a full-fledged tragedy in their lives. "What'd she die of?" he asked sympathetically. Phoebe's voice broke as she tried to explain. "I don't know, except he stopped singing the last couple of days. She must have been sick." He sensed the need to divert their attention away from their grief. "That's too bad. Do you think we better have a funeral for her?" This idea pleased Phoebe. "I'd like that," she blubbered. "We'd better go ask Susanna if it's all right first," suggested Fanny, drying her eyes. "You go talk to her and I'll get the plank ready," said Huntley, who was beginning to enjoy his new role as comforter and friend. As the twins ran down the nearby hatchway, Huntley got the plank from the storage place and put it on the bulwark. He found some canvas and cut a small corner piece from it. He found a few nails in the carpenter's toolbox, placed them in the canvas, and tied it to a piece of twine. Just then, Susanna stepped through the hatchway with the twins in hand and headed for the birdcage. "Oh, our poor little companion," she said as she reached into the cage and brought Lovey out in her hand. "I was hoping she'd be with us for the entire trip. I wanted Mummy and Edward to see her once again." This brought a new round of sobs from the twins, but not as loud as the first time. Hoping to distract them from their grief, Huntley changed the subject. "Are you ready for the service, ma'am?" This statement caused the twins to abruptly turn off their waterworks. With a quick wink, Susanna let Huntley know the game was on. "Thank you for your kind attention, mate. You may proceed." "Let's place her here on the plank," he said as he took the bird from Susanna. The tiny bird looked very disproportionate on the full-size burial plank, but the twins didn't seem to notice the incongruity. "We'd better weight her down, he said as he tied the small bundle of nails to Lovey's legs. The twins were so caught up in the procedure that they almost forgot they were sad. "We're here today to bury Lovey in the deep blue sea," Huntley said. "Do you have any last words to say?" This caused deep thought, and then triggered a response from Phoebe. "She always sang when I was sad," she said. Completely serious, Fanny added, "She always sang when I was happy." This caused both Susanna and Huntley to smile. "Lovey, you will be sorely missed," said Susanna, returning to seriousness. Huntley suppressed a laugh. "We now commit her body to the deep. Will you help me lift the plank?" Susanna and the twins stepped forward and helped Huntley lift it up. The bird slid off and plopped into the water, immediately sinking out of sight as the ship pushed on. Phoebe leaned over the bulwark to try to see Lovey one last time. "Goodbye, Lovey," she waved. "We'll see you again in the next life." This statement made Huntley snicker, and he automatically responded, "The next life? And just how do you know you'll see Lovey again in the next life?" Fanny was quick to reply, "Because Jesus died on the cross so everyone will be resurrected, even you." Huntley was taken aback. "Is that a fact?" he said incredulously. "Yes, don't you read the Bible?" said Phoebe. Huntley's face colored with embarrassment. "McGram used to read to me when I was a nipper, but sorry to say, I never learned to read myself." "Well, if you want, Susanna can teach you how to read in her reading class," said Fanny. "And we can make sure you learn all about Jesus." Huntley reared back and shook with laughter. "I'm too old to learn anything new." Then his eyes met Susanna's, and she nodded her head to assure him. "We meet every day at 10 o'clock on the boat deck, Mr. Huntley. I'll be expecting you." Saturdays were usually spent getting ready for Sundays. Parents of families wanted to get as much done as they could to minimize their work on the Sabbath. Families did the laundry, and mothers and fathers worked to get their families washed and scrubbed and their best clothes ready for the service the next day. Mothers cooked twice as much as they needed on Saturdays, so that on Sundays they wouldn't have to go to the galley. Sundays were occupied with the usual morning and evening prayer meetings, but there was also the added benefit of being able to partake of the sacrament at the weekly sacrament meeting held in the afternoon, when the entire company met on deck. Everyone tidied up for this special worship time. They would be meeting with the saints from all the other wards at the same time. It was a lovely Sunday afternoon, and everyone looked forward to the messages of the speakers. Smiles abounded as the saints sang the opening song cheerfully, and the sacrament song reverently. The returning missionaries passed the sacrament, and then President Bramwell spoke. "We are blessed with another of our Heavenly Father's lovely days, without a cloud to mar the beauty of a lovely blue sky, and a smooth sea with a light wind so pure as to scarcely be felt on the cheek of one of our pretty Mormon ladies." This caused everyone to chuckle in delight. Then, instead of the regular sermon, President Bramwell presented a proposal to the company. "Brothers and sisters, the week is sufficiently long to worry you with its monotony, so I propose that we plan as many activities as we can for the remainder of our voyage. These activities will have a reviving tendency that will not only divert you, but keep many of you out of mischief," he said as he looked directly at a group of giggling, squirming boys on the front row. "Today we are going to appoint several committees. These committees will plan appropriate activities for the youth and those older. I envision groups practicing instruments, preparing dances, planning programs and concerts, schooling the children, teaching English to our Welsh brothers and sisters, playing games, establishing appropriate exercise, and making tents and wagon covers for our journey across the plains. Everyone will be on one committee or another. Please use your time and talents to make this a success." With that, The priesthood leaders assigned the various committees. The deck was soon alive as the saints got their committee members to come up with the idea for their particular assignments. "What assignment did you get called to, Eleanor?" Caroline asked when the seven sisters got back to their berths. "I'm feeling quite overwhelmed," said Eleanor. "I've been called to lead up the female sanitary committee, with each ward caregiver under my direction. I don't feel like I'm skilled enough to train these women." Phoebe smiled. "You've always got the doctor's book," she said as she handed it to Eleanor. "I'm on the committee to see that the beds are made on our deck," said Lizzie, "and the louse committee. I begin tomorrow checking all the children for lice and dusting their heads with powder. It's a lousy job, but somebody has to do it," she said, trying to keep a straight face as the others laughed. Lavinia explained her assignment. "I'm on the Tents of Zion committee. The Amazon company has been assigned to make 25 tents and 25 wagon covers before we arrive in New York. There will be a grand ceremony when all the tents are completed, and I'll be working with Brother Careless on music for the event." All the sisters committed to help sew the tents and wagon covers. They were grateful for any new task to help them pass their long hours on deck each day. "In addition to my reading, teaching the children in our ward to read," said Susanna, "I will also be teaching the Welsh saints how to speak English." "We have been called to the Children's Exercise Committee," announced Phoebe. "We know lots of games, don't we, Fanny?" "What we don't know, we can make up," Fanny added playfully. Susanna worried about her mischievous twin sisters, but knew they were fun-loving and full of life and would keep things hopping for the other children. Only Caroline was left to share her committee. "I've been called to be on the social committee to plan the 4th of July celebration," she announced with elation. "I can hardly wait for tomorrow to come so I can get started." The sisters continued chattering as they prepared and ate a light supper. They had a hard time keeping from whispering during the evening prayer meeting, and when they tried to settle down in their berths to go to sleep. They were so wound up that they ended up talking far into the night. After breakfast the next morning, the children from each ward assembled on different parts of the deck to be taught reading by the instructors who had been called from each of their wards. Susanna had had some experience as an assistant instructor in a parish school back home in Whittington and loved her teaching assignment on the ship. The children she taught shared several Bibles as they sat on makeshift benches of boards laid over small barrels. They huddled over their books and followed the words with their fingers. A freckle-faced girl read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Her equally freckled brother sat beside her, and read the next verse, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." The next reader slowly sat up straight and took a deep breath. He was head and shoulders taller than the rest of the children. It was Huntley, who had joined them for his promised reading lesson. He read slowly and deliberately, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit." Phoebe leaned over and corrected him. "Inherit," she whispered. "Inherit the earth," he repeated perfectly, then smiled all over. "Very good, Mr. Huntley," Susanna praised, and the children clapped their hands lightly to give him confidence. "Class, we're pleased Mr. Huntley has joined us in our reading class today. And now I have a surprise for you. Mr. Huntley is going to become the teacher for a while. He's going to help us study ocean life." "Ocean life?" questioned Matthew. "Fish," said Susanna. "I've been on the ocean for almost 30 years now, and I've seen a lot of fish," said Huntley proudly. "I'm going to point out some of the different kinds you will be seeing." Phoebe was quick to add, "But don't believe him when he says there are mermaids that come up and look in a mirror and comb their hair." Huntley laughed a bit sheepishly. "No, I promise I'll just stick to fish." On the other parts of the ship, the missionaries who weren't distributing rations or water below deck were laying out canvas material and measuring and cutting it for the tents and wagon covers that the ship's company was expected to complete before they arrived in New York. They tried to find places that didn't bother the sailors' movements, but from the snarls and grumbles they heard, they knew they needed to get material out of the walkways as soon as possible. They would only be able to cut out enough to get the stitchers started. Lavinia helped hand out the newly cut packages to the brothers and sisters on the committee, who promptly distributed the material to the different groups that had congregated. Before long, there were circles of women, young girls, and a few men stitching on the yards and yards that went into each tent. The canvas was thick, and it was difficult to pull the heavy needle and thread through it, especially when it was folded over. But after they became familiar with the sewing procedure, they enjoyed the repetition of the work because they could do it automatically without having to think too much, and could talk and get to know their new brothers and sisters in the gospel better. Lavinia was standing on the captain's deck, surveying the activity below, when George approached her side. Turning to him, she smiled with satisfaction. "Everyone is busy as bees, and merry as crickets," he chuckled. "I know this is a little early to be asking, but do you have any ideas for the Tents of Zion ceremony?" asked Lavinia. "I've been reading in Exodus about the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness," said George, "and I think we could start at the stern of the ship and march forward to the bow, with the priesthood leaders 3 abreast in the front and the committee members close behind. I've almost got the music arranged and ready to introduce to the band and the choir at their practices tomorrow." "That sounds wonderful," Lavinia gushed, starting to visualize just how grand the ceremony would be. She took a deep breath and held it for a few seconds. Then, letting it out slowly, she said, "I guess I shouldn't get the cart before the pony. First comes the work." She then excused herself and moved down the steps to walk around and make sure everyone had enough sewing supplies. Lizzie had never shied away from work. In fact, she loved to work. The harder the assignment, the better. She liked being in charge of bed making. After a few days, she almost had everyone trained to get out of their beds and straighten their covers for the day. After breakfast, when she felt everyone had had sufficient time to rise and shine, she went around the 'tween deck, and what wasn't straightened completely, she pulled here and tugged there. It was hard to have the whole area looking neat all at once because of the many boxes, trunks, and valises full of clothing and personal items stored around the berths. But the newly made berths did help everything look more uniform and tidy. Everyone kept busy with their committee assignments each day, but lagging behind, as usual, one morning was Sister Walmsley, who was the lone saint still in her berth. She was writing in her journal and wasn't going to be rushed to finish her thoughts. She was keeping an eye on Lizzie, who had finished her bed-making supervision and had moved past her twice without saying anything. Lizzie was now getting the children lined up for their hair inspection. Sister Walmsley continued to write. "It has been discovered that we have other passengers along that were not counted on at the start of our journey. They seem to increase from day to day, so rapidly that no one would think of counting them. They are not large livestock, but nearly everyone has felt their presence, as has been observed by the continual scratching which we are now and then engaged." At that, Sister Walmsley couldn't help but automatically respond to scratch the base of her neck. "Sister Walmsley, would you fetch me another bag of dusting powder?" said Lizzie, trying to get her involved in the louse committee duties to which she had been assigned. "I suppose I could do that," she grumbled under her breath as she put her journal away and slipped off her berth. The children were good-natured about the ritual of having their hair searched through every few days. Some escaped with lice-free heads, but there were a few sneezes from those being disinfected with the dusty powder that fluttered down around their noses. After each child was set free, they ran up the hatchway and joined the other children on deck, ready to play games for a few minutes before their reading class began. Phoebe and Fanny were there already, choosing up sides. When each child arrived, they were placed on one of the other's team. "How many of you know how to play Charlie, Charlie, Butcher Boy?" questioned Fanny. A few hands went up, along with eager vocal responses. "I'd better explain it for those of you who haven't played it before," suggested Phoebe. "Each team gets into a huddle and decides what trade you are going to act out. Then the first team skips toward the second team, who is in a long line, and they chant, 'Charlie, Charlie, Butcher Boy, coming for a trade.' The second team answers, 'What's your trade?' 'Sweet lemonade,' they reply. Then the second team says, 'Get to work and show us if you're not afraid.' The first team then acts out something like, say, 'being a shoemaker or digging a ditch,'" said Fanny as she gestured. "Then the second team tries to guess what it is. If they guess it right, the second team runs after the first team, who is trying to get back to their goal without being caught. If anyone does get caught, they end up onto the other team. Understand?" "Yes, let's play," said the children, jumping up and down. "All right," said Phoebe. "Now, everyone get into your huddles." And the children squealed with laughter as they began working very hard. at playing. That's the end of 6A. Stay tuned for 6B. Over and